Hey everybody, this is Bob from Music and Arts, and this is our live stream on choosing a saxophone mouthpiece. Just pull my chair up here and get ready. So if you have ever shopped online or in a store for a saxophone mouthpiece, you know that there are lots and lots of choices. There are different materials, usually plastic, hard rubber, metal. There are even hybrid mouthpieces like this one that has a metal shank and a metal chamber kind of fused with a hard rubber body. And there are prices, everything from, say, $20 all the way up to several $100s. And you've even got all those technical terms that you'll see that you need to negotiate: facing and tip opening and baffle and chamber size and all of these things. So how do you negotiate this very technical and confusing world of the saxophone mouthpiece? And why is this choice important? Well, the choice is important because your setup, the combination of your mouthpiece, your ligature, and your reed, probably has a greater impact on your sound than your horn does. Of course, a very inexpensive instrument isn't going to sound like a very expensive instrument, and yes, there are instruments that are specially designed to be towards jazz or more towards classical playing or a certain style of classical playing. But there are there's a point at which there's going to be a lot more effect on your sound by your mouthpiece and your reed than by how much money you spend on your horn. At the end of the day, it makes a lot more difference to your sound. What you're really paying for as you go up in price in horns is a saxophone that is better in tune with itself, a saxophone that has a lighter, more facile action that makes playing difficult technical passages a lot easier, more than you're paying for a better sound as you go up in quality in the instrument. So in terms of sound, a good mouthpiece and the right reed, one is always a good investment, and two really is where you're going to tailor your sound to be what you want it to be. And particularly if you're a younger player or a beginning player that's starting to really, get your legs under you on the instrument and you want to sound better, it's going to give you a lot of bang for your buck to invest in a good mouthpiece, and a mouthpiece that's designed to do the kind of playing you want to do. On the other hand, if you are already a really good sax player and you already own a really good instrument, but you're still not quite happy with your sound, or you have to do a different kind of playing than you usually do, buying a different mouthpiece and choosing the right mouthpiece will let you refine that sound to be exactly what you need it to be. So of the three parts of your setup, the mouthpiece, the reed, and the ligature, the mouthpiece and the reed have more impact on your sound than the ligature does. And today I'm going to talk mainly about the mouthpiece. So your first question that you need to ask yourself, obviously, is what kind of playing am I going to do? and therefore what sound do I want to produce. If I'm someone who is playing mainly in concert bands, wind ensembles, maybe sax quartets, or I'm a classical soloist, I want a darker sound, I want a very round sound, and a sound that blends well with other instruments. If I'm playing in a jazz band or maybe a combo, I want a sound with a little more buzz to it, a little fuzz maybe, depending on what kind of jazz you're playing. You might want a little more or a little less edge, but you don't want that dark, round sound of a classical player. And then, of course, if you're playing in a rock band, generally speaking, saxophonists with rock bands have very, very buzzy sounds with a lot of power, very bright, a lot of edge in the sound. And it's your mouthpiece at the end of the day that's going to dictate that sound. So the first thing you do then, once you know what type of sound you want to create, is you're going to look at all these different materials, and you're going to say, oh my gosh, which material is best for this? And again, mainly we're talking about plastic, hard rubber, which actually looks a lot like plastic and feels a lot like plastic, but is actually vulcanized rubber. It's sometimes called ebonite. And metal, but there are also crystal mouthpieces out there. There are wood mouthpieces, porcelain mouthpieces. The last three, though, are pretty niche-y, but they do exist. And there's a lot of conventional wisdom out there in the world about how these different materials affect your sound. And most people will tell you that if you want that dark classical sound, you must play hard rubber. Metal mouthpieces are always bright and kind of brash and really are only good for jazz or rock playing. And you know, a lot of people will tell you that the plastic mouthpieces are basically just for students, or, you know, kind of the throwaway piece that comes with a horn when you buy it, but no one serious would ever play on plastic. And that's kind of the conventional wisdom that's out there. But the fact is that none, or at least very little of this is actually true, at least in terms of sound. Research has shown that the material has little or no effect on the sound that the mouthpiece produces as heard by the listener. And that's a very important distinction, the listener as opposed to the player. Now, when you play on these different materials, you may indeed feel that there's some difference in sound between the different materials. But it's important to remember that just like when we hear a recording of ourselves speaking, right, that recording never sounds to our ears like our voice sounds to us as we speak, because we're not hearing it the same way that a listener hears it. And that's also true, unfortunately, of our playing, because we are physically attached to the instrument when we play. Our teeth are touching the top of the mouthpiece, our lip is on the reed, our lower lip, hopefully, is on the reed. You know, the mouthpiece is physically inside of our oral cavity. And so we're getting the vibrations not just through the air around us, but also through you know, our skeletal structure, through our bones and our actual body, and that causes us to hear it differently and perhaps perceive very, very, very subtle differences that the listener never hears. So just to a very large extent, what material you're talking about doesn't matter. So what does matter when you're trying to get the sound you want? Well, it is the basic anatomy of the mouthpiece. It's the dimensions of the mouthpiece. And I have a visual aid. Yay, visual aids. So here is a mouthpiece as if it were cut in half, so that you're looking at the inside of the mouthpiece here. And, you know, the first thing you have is the tip opening, which is actually the distance between the reed and the tip of the mouthpiece. Then you have this part of the mouthpiece here along the inside, which is called the baffle, and how high or low, high being more in this direction, low being more in that direction, counterintuitively. How high or low that baffle is will affect your sound. And then right in this area, you have what's called the chamber. And the chamber, the shape of that chamber and the size of that chamber will also affect your sound. Today, I'm mainly going to talk about the tip opening and the baffle, because those have the most effect. And first, we're going to talk about the tip opening. So again, just to use another visual aid, the tip opening, we're literally talking about that gap between the tip of the reed, the end of the reed, and the end of the mouthpiece. So that little opening right there. That is measured, generally speaking, in 1/1000ths of an inch. And very small changes in the dimensions of the inside of a mouthpiece, not just the tip opening, but the thickness of the rails and the size of the chamber and the height of the baffle, can have very large effect on the sound and the way the mouthpiece plays. So generally speaking, again, smaller tip openings require less air. They're generally perceived as easier to play. The sound is darker and they feel more pitch stable. For these reasons, smaller tip openings are generally good for beginners because they're easier to play. They don't have to put through much, particularly young beginners, because they don't have to put as much air through. So an elementary school student or a middle school student who hasn't finished growing and maybe doesn't have the lung capacity or the musculature in the diaphragm hasn't developed as much, is going to have an easier time with a smaller tip opening. Also, classical players, generally speaking, at least across the broad range of tip openings, tend to play at the smaller end of that scale because that gives you that darker sound that they're looking for. And you know, another player that might want to, as we mature as human beings, as we age, maybe a very experienced player starts to have trouble supporting all that air that needs to go through a horn, and perhaps buying a new mouthpiece with a slightly smaller tip opening is going to allow them to continue playing more comfortably. So that's when you're going to want the smaller tip openings. Classical playing beginners, or perhaps if you just feel like you're starting to have trouble playing your horn and need to put less air through the horn. I'm also a good example. Besides being a classical saxophonist, my first instrument is the oboe. So I'm used to an instrument that takes very, very, very little air, especially as compared to a saxophone. So, you know, I tend, even in the classical range of tip openings, I play on a very closed tip opening because I'm more comfortable on it. It's easier for me to play because I'm used to an oboe, which takes so little air. Larger tip openings generally produce bigger sound. They take more air to play, so they're generally perceived as a little harder to play. They generally will give you a brighter sound, a sound a little more edge. And they do make effects that you find, especially in jazz and rock, like tone bends, doits, things like that. They make them easier to do because there's more distance between that reed and that mouthpiece, and that gives you more play. Generally speaking, you also will play a softer reed on a larger opening and a harder reed on a smaller opening. So again, there's more play with that larger opening that lets you do those tone effects, those pitch effects like tone bends. So larger openings are generally used by advancing players and jazz and rock players who want that brighter sound. But you know, again, these are all general statements. And certainly when I say that a larger tip opening are used by advancing players, the goal is not to play on ever more open mouthpieces, regardless of what kind of music you're playing. That certainly is not the case. You know, nor do jazz players always play on more open mouthpieces than classical players do. There have been many famous players like Coleman Hawkins and Stan Getz and Charlie Parker who played on very closed mouthpieces for much of their careers. So just like we don't all wear the same size shoe, each player will have a different tip opening that is comfortable for them. And it's all about finding what works best for you. So how do you do that? Well, the manufacturers throw us a little bit of a curve, and designers, because they don't use a standard scale. Although, as I said, tip opening is measured in thousandths of the inch or millimeters, what you will see on the side of most mouthpieces is there's a marking. Markings like C star, C double star, 145, 7. And these are all indications of the tip opening, but unfortunately they aren't telling you what the actual tip opening is. But if you go online And different manufacturers use different scales. And even within one manufacturer, you will find that they use different scales. For example, Selmer Paris doesn't use the same tip opening scale on all of their models. So how do you negotiate this? Well, you go out on the web and you search for saxophone tip opening charts, and you will find things like this. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read this, but basically what you have here is down the left side of the page, you have a list of a variety of saxophone mouthpieces by different manufacturers, different models. And across the top, you have tip openings in both thousandths of the inch and millimeters. That's why I like this one. It has both. And then in here, you have those markings. So in here, you would find the mouthpiece. And when you look on a chart on that, like this one, what you see, what this chart tells you is, for example, if you're talking about a Selmer S80 Seastar mouthpiece, very, very, very common mouthpiece, saxophone mouthpiece, particularly for alto, but for tenor as well, that has a tip opening of 67 one-thousandths of an inch, and that is the equivalent of a Yamaha 5C mouthpiece or a Selmer Paris S90 190. So these charts are how you can tell, okay, if I like this tip opening, this is the marking on the side of all the different models that I'd be looking for. Here's a model with a very similar tip opening. You're going to use these. You can go out and get that great tool on the internet, and there's lots of them out there. All right, so that's tip opening. Next thing I want to talk about is the baffle. Again, the baffle is kind of the inside top part of the mouthpiece, this area right here. And how close that comes to the reed on the inside of the mouthpiece is going to determine how dark or bright the mouthpiece is. And so a very, very, what they call a low baffle, or a baffle which is farther away from the reed, is going to give you a darker sound, and a very high baffle, one that is closer to the reed, is going to give you a much brighter, edgier sound. So if I show you, I'm going to try to show you these two. I hope there's enough light and that the camera can see it. If you look in these two mouthpieces, you'll see that they look very different inside. That one you can see a lot more, you can see this one is much deeper than this one. This one has a much lower baffle. This one even has what's called a broken baffle. You can see it's quite shallow initially, and then it has an angle and drops off. This is a much brighter mouthpiece than this one is. And you know, one, obviously the one with the lower baffle is a classical mouthpiece. It's a Eugene Rousseau classic, and the other is a Barry Infinity. High baffles that are closer to the reed, provide edgier, brighter sound and louder sounds, and those are good choices for rock players and jazz soloists. And low baffles that are farther from the reed are good choices for give you a richer, darker sound and with less edge, and those are more for classical players or concert band, wind ensemble type playing, where you want to blend with other instruments. Good examples of those low baffle mouthpieces: the Selmer S80 that I mentioned before, the Selmer Soloist, the Van Doren Optimum, and the D'Addario Reserve are all good, excellent classical mouthpieces. On the jazz side, on the high baffle side, there's the Jody Jazz Jet, the Barry Infinity, the Theo Wani Shiva, and more and more and more. There's many, many choices. And then there are also mouthpieces that kind of have a medium baffle, somewhere in between those two extremes. And these work well if you are a player that has to play both, say you're a high school player, you play in the concert band or the wind ensemble, you also play in the jazz ensemble. You want a slightly different, maybe you want a slightly different sound. Maybe you want one mouthpiece for both, though, because mouthpieces are not inexpensive and you can't afford to buy both. Well, there are kind of intermediary ones that will work well. They'll do a sound that will work well in both, or you can change your reed to make the sound brighter or darker by using a classical cut reed for a darker sound and a jazz cut reed for a brighter sound, and use that same mouthpiece. And good examples of those would be like the Van Doren's V16, the Jody Jazz HR Star mouthpiece, or the D'Addario. I would put the D'Addario Select Jazz in that same category as well. All good choices to kind of be able to live in both worlds a little bit. So again, very important to remember that very small changes in the interior dimensions of a mouthpiece can have big effect on the sound and response of a given model. So remember to think first about what kind of playing you want to do. For classical, concert band, wind ensemble playing, look at mouthpieces with low baffles, medium to large chambers, and lean towards smaller tip openings. For jazz and rock, look for mouthpieces with high baffles, medium to small chambers, and larger tip openings. Most importantly, you need to remember that we are all different physically, right? Our teeth are different, our oral cavity is different, our throat opening, our sinus cavities, they're all different. So the mouthpiece that works for your buddy and sounds great may not work as well for you. And you know, we're all different. So try many combinations if you can, if you have that opportunity. Try a lot of different things, different tip openings, different baffles. And don't forget to change your reed up and see what reed is more comfortable, not just in strength, but in cut as well, because there are a lot of different choices out there to find exactly the right fit for you. So I hope that this has been interesting. I hope that it has been helpful in demystifying the technical world of the saxophone mouthpiece. And I hope you'll keep tuning in to our M&A live streams for more informational things like this, as well as some of the performing that we're putting out there, working with various artists. And in this very difficult time for all of us that we're all living through right now, we hope you will remember the gigging artists out there, many of whom are struggling because their gigs have been canceled. You know, I'm fortunate in that I'm not reliant on the playing that I do for my income, but many musicians are, and all of their gigs have been canceled. So if you're in a position to do so, go out there, buy music online, buy an album on your download, you know, whatever download service you like to use to help support those artists that are perhaps struggling a little bit. And again, continue to tune in. Thanks for watching. I hope this was informational, and have a great night, everybody.